Thanks everyone for being here today. And this is the first day, obviously, of the 2-day Iowa Ideas Conference with the Gazette. This is the lower college enrollments session within the education and the higher education track. And I just want to start off the session by thanking our sponsor, Kirkwood Community College.
Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm Lori Sundberg. I'm the president of Kirkwood Community College, and we are proud to be a sponsor of this year's conference. The Iowa Ideas Conference brings educational sessions on a variety of topics to Iowans from all over the state. It is a terrific conference, and we are proud to be a part of it. So on behalf of the 2021 Iowa Ideas Conference, welcome, and I hope you enjoy your time at the conference. Thank you.
Thanks again. So obviously we're very thankful for this sponsorship, and I just want to start this panel discussion by introducing our three panelists. The first here we have is Eric Kelderman. He's a senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education, covers a range of topics including enrollment, policy, lots of things that have to do with higher education. We have Mark Wiederspan. He is the president or NCO or the executive director of Iowa College Aid, which is the state's sort of financial aid agency looking to increase accessibility for students across the state. And then we have Sally Johnstone. She's the president of the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems out in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, I think. Is that correct, Sally?
Yes, it is.
Great. So I just wanted to let each of them talk just briefly to start this off about, give some background and talk about why they know something on this topic. Eric, do you want to start with you?
Sure, glad to do it. And by the way, thanks for giving me this opportunity. I mentioned to Vanessa that I'm an Iowa native, and it's great to be back to talk to my people. And I'm a frequent reader of Vanessa's very, very excellent work on higher education. We started covering the enrollment issue sort of in depth, I would say a couple of years ago. There was a book that came out by a professor at Carleton College named Nathan Graw called Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education. I'm looking at it over here on my desk. And the numbers had been known for quite a while that there was a decline in high school graduates, and Professor Graw laid out a much more sort of detailed analysis of that. And really the way it became big for the Chronicle is that it started to affect not just, public regional institutions, but more selective institutions started having trouble filling their classes. And in the higher education world, that's a big deal. Not the Ivies, but maybe the next tier of selectivity. And so we wrote some stories about that, and it became a big deal. And then we followed that somewhat regularly since. And of course, the pandemic has made a big dent in college enrollments in fall 2020.
Yeah. I just want to note we actually had Nathan Graw on one of our panels over the summer in terms of talking about enrollment stuff. But yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, hi. So Iowa College Aid, we are a state agency that not only oversees the state financial aid programs, but we also oversee our state's post-secondary authorization. We also have a wide variety of community engagement programs where we work to help foster a college-going culture within a high school, as well as in particular communities throughout the state. And then lastly, we also do research. So it's always natural that, enrollment is a very big part of what we do as an agency. We promote post-secondary education in the state. Our research also looks at what are the best interventions or what are the trends tell us about enrollment. Because really, Iowa College Aid is the only sort of state agency, and really the only kind of center that just focuses on higher education broadly. We don't focus on one particular sector of an institution. We're all about promoting post-secondary education. So we have a very vested concern about future enrollment for our state, not only for our colleges, but also for our future workforce demands. So it's very important for us as an agency to keep track of understanding what those enrollment trends are and what the future is going to hold for higher education.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And go ahead, Sally.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks for the chance to interact with these esteemed colleagues. I lead NCHEMS, as Vanessa said, and we work with multiple states across the country to help them solve issues that arise with their higher education, both institutions and systems, around finance and governance and quality and basic practices for higher ed. And our work always starts with data, and then we try to help the constituents we're working with turn that into usable information. And I hope I can do that today. And a lot of the statistics I'm going to quote come from WICHE's, Western Interstate Commission for Higher Ed, knocking at the college door. And they've actually done a post-COVID addition or addendum that I've been able to pull some interesting things out of and have a chance to share some.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you. I think that's one place I kind of wanted to start is we touched a little bit in your introductions on this enrollment cliff and what we were looking at before COVID came. So could one of you or a couple of you just kind of talk a little bit about that cliff and why it's predicted to happen, or it was at least?
Sure, I'd be glad to dive in, and then I'm sure Mark and Eric would have other things to add.
Yeah.
When we talk about pre-COVID predictions, the Midwest was anticipating having a considerable number of fewer high school grads by the 2030s, so less than a decade away. In Iowa, that was a little offset by a rise in their Latinx or Hispanic population that was entering into the school systems. And we can talk about these new populations and COVID effects as we move into this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Go ahead.
you know, I think Sally alluded to this broadly, right? There's a geographic differentiation nationally when you look at this decline, right? The New England and the upper northeast United States, the upper Midwest, where the population of white high school graduates has been declining, and we've known this for some time, as Wichi has pointed out, that the number of high school graduates, white high school graduates, is declining in areas that are more diverse, in the South and in the West, where you have larger populations of Hispanic and African American and Asian populations. Those numbers continue to rise, and we know that by the mid 2040s or so, we're going to be what's called a majority minority country overall, right? So the white population will be in the minority at that point compared to the overall number of racial and ethnic minorities. And but it doesn't affect all parts of the country equally. And Iowa being sort of in that upper Midwestern area, it's gonna decline, and that means that, of course, colleges have to go out, and if they want to maintain their enrollment numbers, they're going to have to recruit a more diverse class, and maybe that means recruiting more students from out of state. It means recruiting more students of color, and it probably means recruiting students who are not from the middle and upper middle class as much. So largely more first generation college students, and more students who are coming from more modest financial backgrounds.
Yeah, and I just want to be clear. So I know that you're saying obviously there's these demographic shifts, and is it also related to the recession in 2008 and a decline in the birth rate? Is it kind of a blend of those two things?
Right. As you talked with Nathan Graw over the summer, you know that he came up with this term called the birth dearth, right? The Great Recession of 2008 caused a very surprising drop in the birth rate across the country. And that's driving this, or it's intensifying it, let's say, right? And we don't really know yet if a similar thing will happen because of the pandemic. And that's, I think, on a lot of college leaders' minds, folks that I talk with, are waiting to see will things actually get worse because of the pandemic.
Right. And Mark, I wonder if you could talk at all a little bit about the gap in terms of graduation rates and like college going rates between the different demographics, because obviously, like we say, minorities are increasing and maybe the traditional,
Yeah, so at least, especially as it relates to sort of the cliff, like that's what we're talking about, is the cliff. And I think we've always anticipated that, we know that the cliff is coming. We knew at some point that there would be a sharp decline in what college enrollment is. And really the sort of the slope of that cliff, or how steep that was going to be, it really depends on our underserved populations. Whether or not we see an increase in their college enrollment, or if there's a decrease. If there's a substantial decrease, then we'll notice that the cliff will be sharper than what we anticipated. I think particularly the way it is for the pandemic, what we are beginning to see is a lot of our underserved populations are not enrolling at the rate that they were pre-pandemic. And so in some ways, we're seeing an acceleration of that cliff. That cliff is almost kind of coming a little bit sooner than what we anticipated. But we are noticing right now that there are significant gaps, particularly amongst our underserved and white students. And it's sort of widening the gap a little bit, not necessarily just on college enrollment, like you were saying, Vanessa, but also on college graduation. I think it gets to the issue of what Eric has even alluded to is, what's the interplay with COVID in these enrollment decisions? Is it because of tuition rates? Is it because of personal reasons of having to stay home, take care of a loved one? Or is it just because some schools are online and students want that on-campus experience? I think, the interaction of COVID on those enrollment decisions needs to be unpacked a little bit. But we are seeing that gap between minority students and widening and white students widening a little bit more than we have in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a perfect segue, obviously, into sort of like COVID. So COVID comes, and we've got before this enrollment cliff, and now it's here. And I wonder if we could sort of dive in and like let people know what actually happened in terms of like numbers and, locally and nationally in terms of enrollment when COVID arrived.
I'll dive in again, just because I have this right here. One thing that really popped out that I thought was quite interesting is the number of 12th graders enrolled in public schools. And from 2018 to 2019, there was a 6% increase. From 2020, from 2019, in other words, COVID effect, there was only a 2% increase, much lower than would have been predicted. In addition to that, the census data on the 2020 birth rates, they're down 4% nationally. I couldn't find that for Iowa specifically, but there's a real decline in birth rates versus what had been predicted. And that decrease is, of course, larger than the pre-COVID trends, which blows all of our predictions kind of out of the water. But it also means that there will be fewer high school grads between 2027 and 2033 because larger decreases are expected. This is just population information. And as Mark pointed out, Iowa, to maintain its enrollment pool, needs to count on minority or underserved populations that typically are not in the higher economic status. And there's a lot of issues with affordability. But after 2033, the prediction is now a very precipitous decline.
Yeah. And Eric, I guess I'm wondering, have you seen any sort of breakout in terms of trends for how COVID impacted? Like, were publics hit hardest or privates, or like did community colleges do okay? Or did you see any differences in terms of the impact of the pandemic across the different sectors?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for the fall of 2020, so a year ago, right? For that academic year, we saw, and I wrote this down just a half second. We saw undergrad enrollment, well, all enrollment was down about 2.4% for if you include undergraduate and graduate students. If you include just full-time undergrads, that was closer to 8%. But it differed quite a bit by sector. So for community colleges, the decline was 16.5%.
Oh, wow.
So a huge decline in community college enrollment. And that's unusual. I don't know if folks know this, but usually during economic downturns, community colleges actually see enrollment increases.
Yeah.
People take time to go back to if they lose their job, they might go back and upskill. But as Mark pointed out, COVID was different, right? Because maybe you had to stay home and help your kid do virtual school, right? If you don't have daycare or school, you were going to go to classes. Maybe you can't take those classes now at the community college because you're watching your own kid, right? Or maybe you had a part-time job at a restaurant to support your lifestyle while you're going to community college, but the restaurant's closed because of COVID. And so then you don't have an option. So those are a couple of the things that I think, may have impacted community college enrollment. By and large, this is true of a lot of things, right? Selective institutions largely did pretty well during the downturn. Large publics did okay. They had a not so bad enrollment decline. What really hurt those institutions though was the loss of what we call auxiliary revenues, right? So money from parking or dining services or athletics in particular, right? All of that fell off, by double-digit numbers for institutions. I did note that, and I was looking up this data in Iowa, and so overall in Iowa it was about a 5.2% decline during COVID. And then what surprised me was a couple of the better known private colleges had the steepest declines in the state. So Grinnell's enrollment fell off 22% in 2020. That's an enormous number. They've got a big fat endowment. We all know that, but even for them, that's a pretty big hit. And then my alma mater, Luther College, had a 14.5% decline in enrollment during 2020. Those were the two largest enrollment declines, even larger than many of the community colleges in the state.
Yeah, I wonder if that has to do with the fact that Grinnell was one of the first to say they were doing sort of online only stuff and pushing that. I mean, just as as a side note, I guess, have you guys seen a pretty clear evidence that students prefer to be in person versus doing this virtual learning that many had to do last year?
I think it depends on the student. I mean, one of the things we have seen is the largest growth in enrollments at some of the national online institutions like Western Governors or Southern New Hampshire, even the University of Maryland's global campus. They're pulling their regions into growth numbers versus the more traditional colleges and universities. So obviously it depends on the student or the learner and what their goals are and what their issues are, as Eric pointed out, whether or not they're going to give up on a more traditional path.
And the census they do like household surveys. Is it quarterly? I think they do quarterly household surveys. Mm-hmm. And during COVID, they started surveying households to really understand how does COVID impacted their family. And they've also asked questions of amongst those college students, like how has COVID affected your college experience? And there's not really one defining metric that will say like, yes, this is the number one reason why people aren't going to college as it relates to COVID. But it's an interesting stat that, in some ways, I think if I haven't looked at the most recent one, but at the heart of it, it was close to like 70-80% of those people in the survey of college were in some way impacted by COVID. And it could be everything that we just talked about. It could be affordability issues, the delivery of the college, It's really hard to pinpoint the specific thing. Now, I anecdotally have talked to, the Regent universities, and they are noticing in some ways a common theme where a lot of students do say that they prefer to be in the dorms, that they do prefer to be on campus. And even with our community colleges, some courses do require lab work, and having it in an online fashion has been very difficult for some of those students. So I can speak anecdotally that yes, there's a lot of students that are saying that they do want to be on college campus, but to what Sally has indicated, I think it really also depends on the student, if they're traditional, non-traditional student, and what their program of study is.
Yeah, and one question I wanted to ask. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
I just wanted to say, the online versus in person is a fascinating debate, and I think there were some students that decided if they had to be online, that maybe they were going to take a year off.
Yeah.
But if you look, for instance, at the university, I want to say the California State University system, really huge system, right? They went all or predominantly online last year, and they actually had enrollment increases almost across the board. So very interesting variations in that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess I was going to ask, I'm not quite sure, because when we look at national numbers and enrollment numbers, often we're looking at sort of fall, September counts. Do you guys have any sense of how many people dropped out mid-year last year? I did some reporting here for the Regent universities, and I think they lost thousands by the time the spring semester started, who had started in the fall. So yeah, I guess I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I can't.
Enrollment did decline more in the spring than in the fall overall, by a couple of percentage points. Not huge, but there was a drop off.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say the same thing as Eric. I mean, that's based on what we're seeing from the National Student Clearinghouse. They're the ones that are sort of providing that global national overview of what has transpired. In Iowa, I can tell you that we are in the process of doing our fall enrollment survey. We send it out every fall to all the post-secondary institutions in the state. We're in the middle of doing that right now. We won't have the final numbers until later November, early December. But the one thing that, as far as, I don't mean to take the conversation back to what was said earlier, but, I can give you at least preliminary, like what we have noticed with those enrollment reports, particularly with our high school students, is that on average, you could sit there. So first of all, Iowa has a very high high school graduation rate. We have like 91%. Of that 91%, about 67% go on to college, right? And if you were to break that number down, you'll see it about averages 12,000 for females. It's about 10,000 for males. And I think what we have seen is a gradual decline amongst male enrollment. It has gone down. It was averaging, like I said, around 10,000. Last year, it dropped to like 9,500. So we are seeing somewhat of a decline amongst the male enrollment. But once we get those sort of numbers, we should have a little bit better perspective of what's happening with this fall enrollment.
Yeah, is that something? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Mark, that differentiation and decline in males is nationwide.
Yeah. Yep.
That was what I was going to ask. And I guess I'm wondering, do you guys have any idea why? What's driving that change?
Oh, how long do we have?
I know.
There are a whole bunch of factors. Including the argument that our education system is better set up for women or girls who mature more quickly than boys who may not be able to focus and do those things that are required for the way in which we've structured the education system. That's one. And I don't know how we change that one, other than I know there's been some national discussions around delaying boys going into even elementary school.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and I guess you kind of started to go into this, Mark, but what have we seen in terms of any rebound for this fall enrollment from last? Are there increases or are there still decreases?
So I don't have the numbers in front of me to really give you a exact number. I can only go, on what's in the National Student Clearinghouse, but what's specific to Iowa, we're still collecting that information. But I think if the last couple years have given us any sort of trend trajectory, we should anticipate somewhat of a decline in enrollment. The gauge that we often use, that's a good metric for us, is just looking at our FAFSA filing rates. I mean, that's always been a good. I'm not saying that it's a perfect measure. I'm not saying that it's the best metric, but it does give you at least a good idea of how enrollment will decline, or how much enrollment will decline, because there is a strong correlation between FAFSA filing and college enrollment, right? Like if you want to get financial aid, you have to fill out the FAFSA. But this past, we saw about a 3 percentage point decline in our FAFSA filing. And so I would anticipate a similar trend with enrollment for Iowa to be right around 3 percentage points, or even 4 percentage points. I think there will be a decline. I just don't know how severe and how specific it will be for Iowa.
Mark, I tried to look that up with regard to the Iowa public institutions. What I found, which I was a little surprised by, and then it made sense, with regard to the Regents universities,
they'll go up.
There were enrollment declines going into fall 2021 for the University of Iowa and Iowa State, but a slight increase at Northern Iowa University. And, when I thought about that a little bit, again, the discussions nationally are that people are choosing to go to college or university closer to home than has been the case in the past. The COVID effect, in essence.
Yeah. And Eric, have we seen any rebound nationally across or within different sectors?
We don't have that data. Last year, the National Student Clearinghouse put out some preliminary numbers in the fall, sort of, I think, as related to everybody's interest on the COVID effect. But as far as I know, that has not happened nationally. Anecdotally, I think I see a lot of press releases about biggest class. So we see some rebound.
Yeah.
That can happen for a number of reasons. It could happen that some of these institutions have changed their admissions policies to let more students in. Things like that. And there might be financial aid, and some of these private institutions in particular might be offering different financial aid incentives to attract more students, to get them back. Certainly one of the very interesting impacts that I think we don't know enough about yet is, during the pandemic, when most institutions pivoted online, about 3/4 of the colleges nationwide offered mostly or fully online offerings in fall 2020 after the spring of 2020, is the long-term offerings that some of these colleges that maybe didn't have a lot of online courses before. What will happen to them in terms of, will they continue to offer that? Will that be a great opportunity for them to enroll more students nationwide? Will they have the money to market that and compete with Southern New Hampshire University and the University of Phoenix and some of these nationwide powerhouses, right? That are these mega universities, we call them, Arizona State University. That I think is going to be a fascinating look. We saw a number of colleges that went online for the first time, really, ever. And they may find some opportunities in that. They got federal money through the CARES Act to bolster their technological infrastructure, and that may give them an opportunity to recruit students online that they didn't have before.
Yeah. And I want to get in a little bit to what people are doing, what the college and campuses are doing to sort of bring students back and get creative about bumping up their enrollment. I want to first remind viewers that if they have any questions, they could send that to our room host through the Whova app, and then they'll come to me and I can ask them. So just a reminder, that's an option. But yeah, what are we seeing the campuses try to do to I guess, recover from this?
That's a great question. I think, private colleges have been on this trend of increasing what's called their discount rate. So increasing their financial aid offerings. That's a long-standing trend. Some of them can do that more. Some of them can't because, and we know that the private college pricing thing is sort of it's very interesting, right? A college says it costs $50,000 a year to go there, and then they offer you a $25,000 scholarship, right? And that happens somewhat ubiquitously. And they're hoping that they get a mix of students who can pay a little more and offset the costs of students who can't pay as much. And so some of those institutions are stretched on that front. Some of it has just been, a change in messaging, right? Come back to our campus, it's safe. Some of it's been messaging about we'll be in person and you can have the college experience that you waited a year for during the pandemic. Some of it has been tuition and pricing changes, including textbooks in the pricing, for instance, or for instance, at Ivy Tech in Indiana is an example I just reported on not long ago where they started this, for them, it's a new program where they say you sign up for full-time, which is 12 credits or 15 credits, I'm sorry, and you can take more than that for nothing, right? So there's things like that. I haven't seen, but beyond that, I'm not really sure what folks are doing. I think they're counting on students being eager to get back to the classroom.
Yeah.
So, there's, to add on to what Eric was saying, the one thing that came to mind was like Central College here in Pella, Iowa. It really fits the bill of what he was talking about. They went through and did a dramatic decline in their tuition rates as a way to bring students back. I think you're also finding very creative ways for institutions to operate, particularly here in Iowa. Like we have an alliance between Iowa Wesleyan and Southeastern Community College that are coming together. I think some of the institutions are not, and I don't know the degree to which that's going to impact the enrollment for both institutions, but I think you'll see that a lot of institutions may do something clever like that to ensure their survival or be able to maintain their course offerings as we go through this COVID pandemic. And there's also, other ingenious ways of which it gets at what Eric is saying for the messaging. Like we have Cornell College, who will be offering loan forgiveness. Like if you come to college and you finish your degree in 4 years and you're good academic standing, we'll forgive a portion of your loans if you graduate. Now, I don't know, the research on loan forgiveness and whether or not it induces somebody to take a particular path, I don't know the degree to which it's going to really incentivize individuals to enroll. I think that design of the program will probably have more effect on their graduation rates. But I could be wrong. The research is still unknown. We don't know. But I think you will see institutions doing clever things like that in their financial aid design, their messaging design, as a way to recruit more people into their schools.
I can't disagree with anything that Mark or Eric has said, but what we're seeing in other states, that particularly the New England states, they've recognized this decline in enrollment and trying to nibble around the edges of traditional practices aren't going to get anybody back into the game in the way that it was 20, 30 years ago. And the reality is you have to talk about serious change in the way that colleges operate, in what they are offering new generations of potential students, and arranging what a college is doing to fit with the life of the student. And in addition to that, decrease the costs for students. But that also means, not just loan forgiveness, it means decreasing the cost of actually offering educational materials.
Right.
And I think another thing to even consider about, we're talking about the institutions themselves. We also need to think about how will institutions respond to state and federal policy. I mean, there's a big push, at least from a federal level, of free community college. I know that's a big thing. I think institutions may respond in some regard to that. Another thing is, like, some states are trying to figure out clever ways of boosting enrollment. Several years ago, one reason to boost enrollment was to make the ACT or the SAT mandatory. The idea being that if you embed those tests in the standardized scores, it lets students know, oh, I could go to college. That's one way. And there is some evidence that did have an enrollment increase. I think what we're also seeing is some states now are making the FAFSA mandatory. Again, trying to break down the barriers of going to college. I think there hasn't been really a lot of research to suggest that mandatory FAFSA increases enrollment. I think that time will tell on it. But I also think there's just sort of also an interplay of state and federal policy that we also need to consider. We're also seeing something similar with, promise scholarships, like what they did at Tennessee. They offer free tuition if you go to a community college, and that saw a significant increase in their college enrollment. We do something similar here in Iowa. We have what's called the Last Dollar Scholarship that provides individuals with free tuition if they go into a particular programs of study at community colleges, and we've seen tremendous significant enrollment increases in those programs of study. But that alone is not enough we obviously need to expand that a little bit more if we want to have an impact on overall enrollment. But more to the point, I think it's really important that we also consider that there's sort of state and federal policy that sort of interplays with this on how institutions will respond.
Yeah, and I mean, not to be doom and gloom here, but I am wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what happens if they don't, aren't able to increase enrollment and that their tuition revenue continues to fall because of that. Are we looking at, schools combining or closing, or what will be the fallout?
Well, we're already seeing it in different areas of the country where we're seeing more of the private institutions either closing or forming relationships with publics even to try and have their brand survive, but in an environment in which they can do things differently. And I think, Vanessa, that's the big push here. As I said before, just playing around the edges is not going to bring people back because the people aren't there. So, I think it was Eric that made the comment about recruiting from other states. Well, guess what? The people that come to Iowa, their states are using the same strategies, and they're working really hard to keep the students that they have. And I know there's been a lot of influx of students from Illinois into Iowa. Well, Illinois got a big push on keeping their students there and making staying in Illinois more affordable than ever, because we do know that if a student goes away from whatever state or area to go to college, the chances of them returning are less than if they stay in state. I mean, look at Eric, here he is in DC, not in Iowa anymore. But
I didn't go to college in DC. I went to college in Iowa.
No. Yeah, I know, and a private, and all that's good. But this is more than just where you go to college or going to college. It's also about keeping a viable workforce in your state. And back to Mark's point about federal and state policies look very seriously at how do we increase the quality of the workforce in our own state. And that can drive and is driving policy in a number of states where they have seen decreases in student populations. They need to keep and serve well those individuals that are in their state and not look for things around the edges that will help them recover a few students.
I do want to inject a little bit of counter argument to Sally's point here, which is, that the Great Recession was going to cause, and we've heard this, right, for a decade or more, right? We heard this from Clayton Christensen, the disruptions to higher education are coming, and we've heard predictions of 25 to 50% of all post-secondary institutions closing by X date, right? The Great Recession didn't cause any of that. The pandemic, as far as we know, has not caused, a flood of colleges to close. Chronicle reporting has showed maybe 15 or so have closed since the beginning of the pandemic, which is in line really with previous years. Now, are these colleges simply dying slower deaths? Maybe, but the sector has proved, I would say, remarkably resilient in the face of overwhelming difficulties. Back in the 80s, early 80s, there was predicted to be a big decline in enrollment that was going to close a bunch of colleges. And in fact, that didn't happen. So we don't really know. And a lot of institutions, I remember reading a Chronicle clip a couple of years ago when I was reporting on the enrollment decline, right? A college that at the time had about 1,500 students and was in dire financial straits, right? And I looked up the website of the college, and this was like a decade old clip, right? And it was still open, and it had maybe 600 students. So is it a super high quality institution with a lot of robust offerings anymore? No, it's not. But it's survived. And
Eric, that was my point, though, is you've characterized that well. Are they still doing the same things they did? No, they've had to change the way they operate. And that's really the gist of my argument, not that places will close. They're going to have to get creative about doing things differently.
Right. And we've seen this for instance, in Pennsylvania, an area where NCHEMS has been intimately involved in helping the state system of higher ed reshape its 14 public regional universities, right? We've seen a move to coalesce some of the program offerings, right? So if you're Edinburgh University in Pennsylvania and you have Russian and Spanish and Italian, maybe you lose those programs, and those students who want to study those languages have to take them online from another school in that system. Things like that are what we're going to see, I think, much more of. But there are difficulties, right? You have to be able to transfer between private institutions and public institutions, right? The transfer policies are incredibly arcane, and it's very difficult for students to take their freshman year at one college and then transfer a whole bunch of credits to another college. So I think that is actually one of the bigger difficulties that's preventing colleges from having, from preventing students to graduate more easily, these articulation agreements.
And Eric, I think that's why we're seeing a number of consolidations around the country. Dallas County Community Colleges from 8 or 9, I can't remember, into one.
Right.
Connecticut, Vermont also is moving in that direction.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, New Hampshire is exploring it right now at the gubernatorial and legislative levels to look at how you can allow for this ubiquitous sharing among institutions. And that, of course, presses for, okay, if your financial model at an institution is based on a student coming there and staying for arbitrarily 4 years, there's a certain financial expectation and decisions that are made around where your money goes in that setting. And if instead you're talking about, hey, we're the best at X, and we're going to make what we do, Italian language studies, available to other colleges and universities, what does that do to the financial models of both the receiving institution and the sending? And working out agreements that allow for bypassing the traditional transfer mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, I was not going to, I agree with exactly what Eric and Sally were talking about. If we're doing a book time, if you ever read the college stress test, this sort of kind of highlights exactly what they're talking about. It's not always, this is not just one thing. But I can tell you just anecdotally, like personally, again, I do, read this book, and, a big thing is a big indicator for institutions is enrollment. When I was in grad school, there was always when I was meeting with college presidents, there was always this like reoccurring theme that if your enrollment drops below a certain threshold, then that's when you need to start worrying as a post-secondary institution. For independent colleges, it's always been around 1,000. That's what when I was talking to a lot of those small independent colleges that traditionally have enrollment around 1,500, that if their enrollment drops below 1,000, then there's a little bit of concern. And so that's always something that I kind of keep a metric on, or I try to always watch when we look at these sort of enrollment reports for Iowa, is how dramatic has the enrollment been at those institutions, and how long has that decline been occurring over the past 5-10 years. And that gives me at least some indicator. I mean, there's other factors though, that like they were saying, like, there's the involvement of tuition rates. It's not, tuition is not always the key indicator of enrollment, but another thing that also is like endowment. I mean, how large is the endowment? What's their expenses to endowment ratio? There's other factors to consider, but one thing that I always sort of look at is just how much has enrollment declined over the past 5 or 10 years. And if it's declined at a significant rate, then I would have a concern for that post-secondary institution.
Right. I guess one question I had was whether, obviously, like traditionally, the pool of students that we're looking at in terms of college-bound students are those coming straight from high school. Are the colleges and universities looking more to bring back adult like workers to get some sort of degree or certificate, master's, anything like that? Are they trying to expand their pool? If it's shrinking.
Well, yes and no. And on the yes side, it's what's been driving some of these different configurations in the community college sector, because they're trying to be able to be much more responsive to local needs. So, really responsive workforce issues that are local. And when you look at trying to bring back adult students, you have to have something for them. And an arbitrary master's degree may or may not have meaning. And I think that was a trend, I don't know, a decade or plus ago. Everybody's got an online MBA, come back and get it. Well, okay, fine. But is the investment on the part of the student worth what it's going to happen to them in their job or whatever? And there's a very interesting report that came out last week from the Brookings Institute that was challenging our broad assumptions about, if you earn an associate's degree, this bumps up your lifetime earnings, or a bachelor's degree or a master's or whatever, and really breaking that down by fields. Yes, in some fields, that's really true. So as any student, whether an adult student or someone coming out of high school, starts thinking about how they want to invest their time and their resources, they need to look at what the outcomes are. And I think we're hearing more and more of that, of the, I'm not quite ready, I don't know what I want to do, and I don't want to go into a bunch of debt that I can't pay off.
Yeah. Is there still like the same level in terms of the value of a degree for students? Could that at all be something they're looking at, about whether...
But Vanessa, it depends on the field.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering if that's at all playing into like the enrollment declines, just in general, like, I guess before maybe I was thinking people thought it was almost an automatic thing, or some populations did, of going to college and getting some sort of liberal arts degree. Are people rethinking that at all, or is the value changing in any way?
I'm not sure we know.
Yeah.
for sure.
There are large questions. I think when you see polling on higher education, right? If you look at Gallup or New America or some of these institutions have been polling on higher ed, there are new and urgent questions from people about that question, about that issue, which is, in general, they understand or they believe that higher education is essential for them to, as we sometimes describe it, like the ticket to the middle class. But the price and the accessibility is definitely creeping into everybody's minds about whether I can afford it and whether it's worth the return on investment. And it doesn't help that in a lot of cases, for instance, Sally mentioned the Brookings report. The Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown has done similar work showing variation in return. And then the Wall Street Journal had a terrific report a couple of weeks ago on these master's degree programs that cost you $50,000, $100,000, and what are you really getting for that? And institutions have been propping these things up. Every public and public flagship and regional university in the United States probably has a master's degree in education that they offer. And why do they offer that? It's because public school teachers get a bump in their salary when they get a master's degree, and so that's a revenue opportunity for the institution in a sense, right? But institutions haven't had to ask the hard questions about, I guess, whether they really should be offering those things. And at some point, we might see some sort of bubble burst in that market.
And Eric, in some states, they've pulled back on the way in which public school teachers are paid and have said just getting a master's isn't an automatic bump in pay.
Right. Okay.
And guess what happens?
People stop enrolling in the master's programs, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I was just going to ask, like, say this all just comes to fruition and some colleges close, some collaborate and combine, get together, the enrollment population is this just right sizing then? Or what could the implications be for, communities and for states if some of these enrollment, trends continue and then colleges don't survive?
Well, I think you raise you hinted a very important point, which is in a lot of these communities, for instance, I'll go back to my alma mater, right? Luther College is probably the largest employer in Winneshiek County, right? And if Luther College doesn't survive, that's a big hit to the county, which, by the way, I think it's one of the poorest counties in the state. So that's problematic. There are ripple effects of these institutions that are much wider than just a couple of thousand students and a few hundred employees. Right sizing, I suppose. I think it depends in large part on a much bigger question, which is, what do employers see as necessary training for their workers? For a long time, for decades now, employers have looked at the college degree as, I guess, an easy screening tool, right?
Yeah.
It shows some persistence, and some academic rigor that the student has endured, and that might be good enough then to use that as a way to weed out potential employees, even if they don't really need that degree or to do the job that they're being hired for. And I think at some point, employers have to really question, well, what is it we want our employees to know, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the best way for them to get that information? I think companies probably don't do as much training as they used to because they've sort of offloaded that to colleges to a certain extent. Will we see a resurgence of companies doing that, or will they start to contract with some of these institutions? We see this at community colleges, right? If Boeing builds a big plant in South Carolina, they might contract with the community college system there to say, you know what, we have to train 7,500 workers and they need skills in X, Y, and Z, right? In manufacturing, CAD, things like that. And so that's an opportunity for some of these institutions.
And to build on Eric's point, some of the major employers throughout the US are moving away from requiring degrees. IBM is basically restructuring its whole hiring process to say, this will be skills oriented, not the default gatekeeper of, do you have a baccalaureate or a master's degree? And instead, really doing the hard work of saying, this is the skill set that we're looking for. Can you demonstrate you have that skill set? And we're seeing also a terrific rise in the number of what some people call alternative providers. I think the most commonly known type are boot camps, that they're basically saying, if you come into our environment, we will guarantee you make it through, and it's going to cost you this much, but the chances that you'll get employed are through the roof. We think there's not much of a quality assurance frame around a lot of these alternative credentials. And that's a call I'm joining in about 10 minutes, trying to sort out what are the issues that we can use both our current structures and others to assure that consumer will know whether or not an alternative credential is really worth it, and is this a reasonable provider?
And I guess I kind of want to push back at the comments. I don't disagree with that. I think though that at least having that conversation of like having particular skill set, particular knowledge in a particular area puts an individual on a specific trajectory, right? And I'm always of the mindset, at least for college students, many 18-year-old, 19-year-olds don't know what they want to do, right? Like they don't, and that's the point of going to college, is trying to figure out, what do I want to do with my life? What do I, it's not necessarily just what you learn in the classroom, but what you learn outside of the classroom. But, that's the function of college, is to help an individual to kind of discover what they want to, who they are and what they want to be in the future. And I get conflicted when we have these conversations, because what the employers want and what the romantic role of what we view as higher education kind of come in conflict right here. Because I don't believe that most 18, 19-year-olds know what they want to do. And if there's pressure on the workforce, like we want this certain skill set, we want it this way, that sort of gives the assumption that institutions need to draw students in on a certain trajectory. And I don't think that's, I don't think that's ever possible. So.
Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time, but this is just such a fascinating topic. The fallout is really interesting and the implications across the country. So we'll keep watching it. And I'm really thankful for everyone joining and for you guys sharing your expertise. So
Vanessa, thanks. And Eric and Mark, fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Really insightful. So thanks everyone for being here.
I really appreciated the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good luck with y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.